These are some of the very first circular saws that Festool ever made. You can actually see right here, there's this little F. That doesn't stand for Festool, that actually stands for fine. Because back then, Fine was actually making the motors for the Festool saws. The problem that they had with these saws, in addition to being extremely heavy, was that the guard for the blade ran inside the housing. And back then, they didn't really have much in terms of kilns and things like that. So a lot of wood that they were cutting was all wet. And when they were cutting, that wet and sappy sawdust would get all caught up inside there, and then this guard wouldn't work very well. So guys were getting frustrated because in addition to having to haul around these giant heavy saws, they were also having the problem with the guard. They also had a problem trying to get the guard out of the way. So a lot of them were reaching down and grabbing the guard and moving it out of the way, which is quite dangerous with the spinning blade. And so you can see as time went on, the saws started getting a little smaller and a little bit lighter, but they were still having the problem with the guards. In fact, the carpenter that was using this saw actually cut a little wedge and just jammed it up in there so that the guard always stayed up inside the housing, and then he kind of prevented that problem from happening. But what he didn't prevent now is that that blade was out in the open and could hurt people. So this is where Mr. Stoll from Festool started to come up with a solution to the problem. And he came up with the idea of putting the guard on the outside of the housing. And that way you wouldn't have as much of the problem with all the chips and sap and sawdust getting stuck inside. And he put this latch here on the outside and made it so that you could open it with your thumb without having to reach down and get your fingers near the spinning blade. And you can see on the front right here, he put a little wheel. So as it was coming in contact with the wood, if you didn't put your thumb here, it would ride against the wood and slowly come up as you pushed your way through. And then here's the next version of the saw. Again, it's getting a little bit smaller, the components are getting a little lighter. And on this one, he put 3 different little wheels right here instead of just the one big one. Now I know I said the saws were getting smaller as they went along, but that doesn't mean they didn't build bigger saws as well. They still had larger timbers they wanted to deal with, but now you've got the bigger saws with the more compact motors, and they have the guard on the outside with the wheel up here on front to help it open as you're going through the timbers. And then the last evolution in this line right here is actually the riving knife. So one thing that ended up happening is with the heavier, bigger saws, there's not really that much risk of kickback. Kickback could happen, and certainly the saw could bind, but these saws were so big and so heavy that they would basically just stall out and not cause much problems. As the saws got smaller and lighter though, you started to have the situation where with the kickback, the saw could come flying out. So there were some people from Switzerland that said, could you please make us a saw that has a riving knife in it? And that way, when the guard starts to lift up and we're cutting through the wood, this riving knife will stay inside the wood and prevent the wood from coming together, which causes the kickback. And if you have some of the saws from Festool right now, like the HKS 55, for example, you'll see that it still has that on there, where on the bottom side of the guard, the riving knife will still stay inside the wood and prevent kickback.